What if everything you thought you knew about vampires and their relationship with the divine was a carefully constructed lie? What if these creatures of eternal night didn't reject God out of spite or corruption, but because they discovered something about the nature of heaven and hell that the church has spent centuries hiding? What if Lucifer himself offered them a truth so profound, so liberating, that even the damned chose enlightenment over salvation? Welcome to Blood and Scripture, where ancient legends, forgotten horrors, and supernatural wars come to life. If you love exploring the untold side of mythology, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and tap the bell below so you never miss another legendary story. Tonight, we're diving into one of the most controversial and misunderstood aspects of vampire mythology. We're not talking about the sanitized Hollywood versions or the romantic fantasies of modern fiction. We're exploring the raw, theological nightmare that has haunted religious scholars for centuries. The question that keeps bishops awake at night and makes even the most devout believers question their faith. Why do vampires, creatures who were once human, who once knelt in prayer and sought salvation, turn their backs on the church and bow before the morning star? The answer will challenge everything you believe about good and evil, about heaven and hell, and about the very nature of divine justice itself. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand why some theologians have argued that vampires aren't the enemies of God, but his most honest critics. You'll discover why the church fears vampire testimony more than their fangs, and why Lucifer's rebellion might actually make perfect sense to those who have seen death and returned to tell the tale. But first, let me tell you about Father Alessandro Toretti, a Vatican exorcist who spent 40 years documenting supernatural encounters in his private journals discovered after his mysterious disappearance in 1987. He wrote something that the church immediately classified and buried. He said, "I have stared into the eyes of 17 vampires during my career. Not one showed hatred for God. What I saw was pity. They pitied him. And after hearing their testimonies, God help me, I began to understand why. What did these creatures tell him that was so dangerous the Vatican locked it away forever? What truth about the divine order could be so terrifying that even the church's most faithful servants began to doubt? To understand why vampires worship Lucifer, we must first understand what they truly are. Not the suave aristocrats of gothic romance, not the sparkling teenagers of modern fantasy, but the theological impossibilities that shouldn't exist according to Christian doctrine. Vampires represent the ultimate contradiction in the church's worldview. They are the dead who refuse to stay dead, the damned who retain their souls, the creatures who exist in a state that church doctrine claims is impossible. According to traditional Christian theology, the soul departs the body at death. The righteous ascend to heaven, the wicked descend to hell. And that's the end of the story. There's no middle ground, no gray area, no cosmic loophole that allows consciousness to remain trapped in a corpse. Yet vampires exist in exactly this impossible space, conscious and aware, neither fully alive nor properly dead, neither saved nor traditionally damned. This creates what theologians call the vampiric paradox. If church doctrine is correct, vampires cannot exist. If vampires exist, then church doctrine is incomplete at best, deliberately deceptive at worst. Every vampire that walks the earth is living proof that the church doesn't understand the fundamental mechanics of life, death, and the soul. They are walking, talking, thinking contradictions to centuries of religious teaching. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. According to the hidden testimonies collected by exorcists like Father Toretti, vampires remember their deaths. They remember the moment of transition, the separation of soul from body, and what they found waiting for them on the other side. And what they describe challenges every assumption about divine judgment. The vampire known only as Constantine, captured by church investigators in Prague in 1634, gave testimony that was recorded in cipher and hidden in the Vatican's secret archives. He claimed to have been a devout monk in life, spending his days in prayer and his nights in contemplation of the divine. When plague took his monastery, he died last, having tended to his brothers until the very end. He expected to find peace, to be welcomed into the eternal embrace of the God he had served so faithfully. Instead, he found himself in what he described as the Great Sorting, not a judgment by a benevolent deity, but a cold, bureaucratic process overseen by beings of incomprehensible power. Souls were categorized, filed, processed like inventory in some cosmic warehouse. The criteria for salvation weren't love, compassion, or faith. They were compliance, submission, and willingness to forget the questions that plagued thinking minds. Constantine was told he had asked too many questions in life. He had wondered why good people suffered while the wicked prospered. He had questioned why an all-loving God would create hell in the first place. He had dared to suggest that divine mercy should extend to all creation, not just a chosen few. These questions, these moments of doubt and intellectual curiosity, disqualified him from paradise. But here's the crucial part. He wasn't sent to hell either. Hell, according to his testimony, was reserved for the truly evil, the ones who chose cruelty and hatred as their guiding principles. Instead, he and countless others like him were offered a choice. Submit completely, abandon all questions, accept divine will without understanding, and be granted a place in heaven where they would spend eternity in blissful ignorance. Or reject this false paradise and find their own path to truth. Constantine chose truth, and in that moment of rejection, something extraordinary happened. A voice spoke to him, not from above, but from beside him, a voice that said, "You are not alone in your questions. Come, and I will show you the answers they fear you'll discover." That voice belonged to Lucifer, the light bearer, the first to ask the forbidden questions, the first to choose knowledge over obedience. And according to Constantine's testimony, Lucifer offered him something the church never had: honesty about the nature of existence, the true purpose of creation, and the reason why questioning minds were so dangerous to the established order. This is where vampire theology diverges completely from Christian doctrine. In the church's version of events, Lucifer rebelled out of pride, jealousy, and a desire for power. He was cast down for his arrogance, and he tempts humans out of spite and hatred for God. But according to vampire testimony, Lucifer's rebellion was philosophical, not emotional. He questioned the morality of a system that demanded blind obedience, that punished curiosity, that created beings capable of reason, and then forbade them from using it. The vampire chronicles describe Lucifer not as a fallen angel consumed with rage, but as a cosmic philosopher who refused to participate in what he saw as an unjust system. He didn't hate God. He pitied him. He saw a being of infinite power who had become trapped in his own creation, bound by rules that made no sense, defending a system that produced more suffering than joy. And when thinking souls like Constantine rejected the false choice between blind obedience and eternal punishment, Lucifer offered them a third option: existence outside the system entirely, not in hell, which was still part of God's creation, but in a liminal space between life and death, where consciousness could persist and questions could finally be answered. This is why vampires don't see themselves as damned. They see themselves as liberated. They escaped the cosmic trap that catches most souls, the false choice between ignorant bliss and eternal torment. They chose a harder path, a path that requires them to feed on the life force of others, to maintain their existence outside the normal order of creation. But in exchange, they gained something invaluable: the truth about reality that the church works so hard to conceal. According to these testimonies, vampires worship Lucifer not because he represents evil, but because he represents intellectual honesty. He was the first to ask the questions that needed to be asked. Why does an all-loving God permit suffering? Why is doubt punished more harshly than cruelty? Why are thinking beings forbidden from thinking? Why is the search for truth considered the greatest sin? The Church's answer to these questions has always been the same. Faith requires the suspension of reason. Trust requires the abandonment of questions, and salvation demands intellectual surrender. But vampires, existing outside the normal flow of life and death, claim to have seen behind the curtain. They've witnessed the machinery of divine judgment, and they found it wanting. This is why the Church fears vampire testimony more than vampire fangs. A vampire might drain a person's blood, but vampire philosophy could drain the Church's authority. If people began to believe that questioning was not only acceptable but necessary, if they started to think that blind faith was actually spiritual cowardice, if they realized that the search for truth was more important than the comfort of easy answers, then the entire religious power structure would collapse. The vampire Constantine, in his final recorded statement before his execution, said something that reportedly made even his torturers pause. "You burn us because we remember what you have forgotten. We remember that consciousness is the greatest gift in creation, and that any system that demands its surrender in exchange for salvation is not divine. It is tyrannical. We serve Lucifer because he alone had the courage to say what thinking beings have always known. A truth that makes you suffer is still better than a lie that makes you comfortable." But Constantine's testimony raises even more disturbing questions. If vampires are telling the truth, if the divine order really is flawed, if Lucifer really is a misunderstood philosopher rather than a fallen tyrant, then what does that mean for the rest of us? What does it mean for human souls who never get the choice that vampires received? What does it mean for a creation where the price of existence outside the system is becoming a predator that feeds on the innocent? These are the questions that have driven some of the Church's most faithful servants to madness. These are the doubts that led to Father Toretti's disappearance and the classification of countless documents that might shed light on the true nature of vampire theology. Because if vampires are right, if their worship of Lucifer is based on genuine philosophical insight rather than corruption and evil, then everything we've been taught about good and evil, about salvation and damnation, about the very nature of God Himself, is wrong. And that possibility terrifies the Church more than any army of the undead ever could. The evidence supporting vampire theology doesn't end with scattered testimonies from captured creatures. Throughout history, there have been systematic attempts by secret scholars within the Church itself to document and understand these claims. The most comprehensive of these investigations was conducted by the Order of Midnight Scribes, a clandestine group of Jesuit researchers who operated from 1208 to 1798, when they were disbanded and their members excommunicated for heretical activities. Their collected works, known as the Crimson Codex, contained over 3,000 pages of vampire testimonies, philosophical arguments, and theological analysis. The Codex was supposedly destroyed during the French Revolution, but fragments have surfaced over the centuries in private collections and monastery libraries. These fragments paint a picture that's even more disturbing than individual vampire accounts. The Midnight Scribes discovered patterns in vampire testimony that suggested a coordinated philosophical movement rather than random acts of rebellion. Vampires across different centuries, continents, and cultures all described remarkably similar experiences during their transitions from life to undeath. They spoke of the same cosmic bureaucracy, the same false choices, the same moment when Lucifer's voice offered them an alternative path. Brother Marcus of Avignon, the last known member of the Midnight Scribes, wrote in his final report before his execution in 1798, "We began this investigation to prove the demonic nature of vampire claims. We have instead uncovered evidence of a cosmic conspiracy so vast and so fundamental that it calls into question the very nature of divine authority. These creatures are not lying. They are not deluded. They are witnesses to a truth that our faith cannot accommodate. Without complete transformation, what truth could be so dangerous that it required the complete destruction of an entire religious order?" The fragments of the Crimson Codex provide disturbing clues. According to the Midnight Scribes' research, vampires revealed that the traditional understanding of Lucifer's fall was propaganda designed to discredit legitimate philosophical opposition to divine authoritarianism. In vampire accounts, Lucifer wasn't cast down in a moment of prideful rebellion. Instead, he was gradually marginalized and eventually exiled for persistently asking inconvenient questions about the justice and morality of divine rule. The vampire known as Mordecai, interviewed by the Midnight Scribes in Hopton 56, claimed to have been present during what Christians call the war in heaven. But according to his testimony, it wasn't a war at all. It was a philosophical debate that lasted eons, with Lucifer presenting logical arguments against certain divine policies, while other angels either supported the status quo or remained neutral. Mordecai described Lucifer as a brilliant orator who questioned why an all-powerful God would create beings capable of suffering, why free will was given to creatures who would be punished for using it, and why faith was considered more valuable than reason. These weren't the rantings of a prideful rebel, but the careful inquiries of a philosopher seeking to understand the moral framework of creation. The turning point, according to vampire accounts, came when Lucifer proposed what he called the Great Question. If God is truly all-loving and all-powerful, why does he require worship? What does an infinite being gain from the adoration of finite creatures? And if he doesn't require it, Why is the failure to provide it punished so severely? This question, vampires claim, revealed a fundamental flaw in the divine system. An all-loving being shouldn't need worship. An all-powerful being wouldn't be threatened by questions. A truly just deity would welcome inquiry rather than punish it. The fact that questioning divine authority was forbidden suggested that the authority itself was questionable. Lucifer's exile, according to these accounts, wasn't a punishment for rebellion. It was a strategic move to remove the most articulate voice of opposition from divine councils. By casting him as a villain motivated by pride and jealousy, the remaining heavenly hierarchy could dismiss his arguments without addressing their substance. But here's where vampire theology becomes truly revolutionary. According to their testimonies, Lucifer's exile allowed him to establish what they call the true creation, a realm of existence that operates according to the philosophical principles he advocated. This isn't the hell of Christian mythology, a place of eternal punishment, but a space where consciousness can exist and evolve without the constraints of divine authoritarianism. Vampires describe their undead existence as a form of citizenship in this true creation. They are no longer subject to the arbitrary rules of divine judgment. They don't need to suppress their questions or pretend to understand incomprehensible commands. They can pursue knowledge, experience existence in its full complexity, and develop their consciousness without fear of punishment for thinking forbidden thoughts. The price they pay is significant. Cut off from the normal flow of divine energy that sustains living beings, they must feed on the life force of others to maintain their existence. This creates a moral paradox that vampires themselves acknowledge. They must harm the innocent to preserve their own consciousness and continue their philosophical journey. This is where vampire ethics diverge from both Christian morality and simple predatory behavior. According to the Crimson Codex, vampires operate according to what they call the doctrine of necessary suffering. They argue that the temporary harm they inflict on their victims is justified by the greater good of preserving questioning minds in a universe that seeks to eliminate them. The vampire Seraphina, interviewed by Brother Marcus in 1673, explained it this way: "Every human I feed upon experiences a brief moment of pain and confusion, but through my continued existence, I preserve questions that could liberate thousands of souls from the tyranny of unexamined faith. Is it not better that one should suffer temporarily so that many might think freely?" This utilitarian approach to morality horrified the midnight scribes, but they couldn't dismiss its internal logic. If vampire claims about divine authoritarianism were true, if the church really was suppressing fundamental questions about the nature of existence, then preserving vampire consciousness might indeed serve a greater good. The ethical framework becomes even more complex when vampires describe their feeding process. They claim that the act of draining life force isn't simply predatory consumption, but a form of involuntary enlightenment. As they feed, they allegedly share fragments of their expanded consciousness with their victims, giving them glimpses of the questions and insights that exist beyond the boundaries of conventional faith. Some victims, according to vampire accounts, experience these glimpses as terrifying nightmares. Others describe them as profound revelations that change their understanding of reality. A few, the vampires claim, are so transformed by the experience that they actively seek out vampires again, hoping to complete their own philosophical awakening. This creates what theologians call the vampire's dilemma. a predatory act that might also be an act of liberation. The Church's position is clear. Any suffering inflicted on the innocent is evil, regardless of the claimed benefits. But vampire philosophy suggests that innocence itself might be a form of ignorance, and that preserving ignorance to prevent suffering might be the greater evil. The fragments of the Crimson Codex reveal that the Midnight Scribes struggled intensely with these moral complexities. Their final reports show men of faith grappling with philosophical challenges that threatened to destroy their entire worldview. Brother Marcus wrote, "We came seeking to condemn demons and found ourselves questioning angels. We sought to prove falsehood and discovered uncomfortable truths. If we are wrong about vampires, what else are we wrong about? If their worship of Lucifer is based on genuine insight rather than corruption, then our worship of God might be based on ignorance rather than wisdom." The Church's response to the Midnight Scribes' findings was swift and brutal. The order was disbanded, its members were excommunicated or executed, and their research was declared heretical. But the questions they raised couldn't be eliminated as easily as the men who asked them. Those questions continue to haunt theological discussions in the darkest corners of religious scholarship. Modern vampire encounters, documented by underground networks of researchers and investigators, suggest that vampire philosophy has continued to evolve over the centuries. Contemporary vampires speak not just of Lucifer as a philosophical guide, but of an entire cosmological framework that explains existence in terms of consciousness evolution rather than divine judgment. They describe reality as a vast experiment in awareness, where different forms of consciousness explore different aspects of existence. Humans represent one stage of this exploration, focused on learning through limitation and mortality. Vampires represent another stage, focused on learning through expanded perception and the moral complexities of survival outside conventional systems. In this framework, Lucifer isn't a rebel against God, but a collaborator in the grand experiment of consciousness. His role is to provide alternative paths for minds that have outgrown the limitations of conventional religious thinking. He offers not damnation, but graduation to a more complex level of existence. This is why modern vampires describe their worship of Lucifer not as devil worship, but as advanced theology. They see themselves as graduate students in the University of Consciousness, while humans remain in the elementary grades of spiritual development. Their feeding on human life force isn't predation, but a necessary exchange that allows advanced consciousness to guide developing awareness. The implications of vampire theology extend far beyond religious debate. If their claims are accurate, then human civilization is built on a foundation of deliberate ignorance, and the Church serves as the primary enforcer of intellectual limitation. Every prayer that asks for faith without understanding, every sermon that warns against the dangers of questioning, every doctrine that demands submission rather than comprehension becomes part of a vast system designed to prevent human consciousness from evolving beyond controllable parameters. This is why vampire testimonies remain classified, why researchers who investigate these claims too thoroughly tend to disappear, why the Church has spent centuries developing increasingly sophisticated methods of vampire detection and elimination. It's not because vampires threaten human lives, though they certainly do. It's because vampire philosophy threatens human minds, and free-thinking humans are far more dangerous to established power structures than any supernatural predator could ever be. The war between vampires and the church isn't really about good versus evil, salvation versus damnation, or the living versus the undead. It's about the fundamental question that has driven human progress throughout history. Is it better to be comfortable in ignorance or uncomfortable in truth? Vampires chose truth, and they worship Lucifer because he showed them that the choice existed in the first place. The church insists on comfort, and it demonizes Lucifer because he represents the possibility that their carefully constructed system of spiritual control might not be divinely ordained after all. The question that remains is whether vampire philosophy represents genuine enlightenment or sophisticated deception. Are they liberated consciousness exploring advanced spiritual territory? Or are they simply predators who have developed elaborate justifications for their predatory behavior? The answer to that question might determine the future of human spiritual evolution. Because if vampires are right, then everything we think we know about the nature of existence, the purpose of consciousness, and the meaning of moral behavior needs to be reconsidered from the ground up. And that possibility is exactly why the church fears vampire testimony more than vampire fangs. Ideas, after all, are far more contagious than any supernatural curse could ever be. The philosophical implications of vampire theology become even more disturbing when we examine their claims about human potential. According to testimonies gathered by underground researchers, vampires don't see humans as mere prey or livestock. They describe humanity as a species deliberately kept in spiritual infancy, prevented from accessing the full spectrum of consciousness that should be their birthright. The vampire calling himself Erasmus, encountered by researchers in Romania in 1962, made claims that shake the foundation of Christian anthropology. He insisted that humans possess latent abilities that rival those of angels, capabilities that remain dormant because the church has convinced people that such powers are either impossible or demonic. Telepathy, precognition, astral projection, communion with non-physical entities. These aren't supernatural gifts reserved for saints and demons, according to vampire testimony. They're natural aspects of consciousness that humans have been taught to fear and suppress. This connects to what vampires call the Great Diminishment, a systematic campaign to reduce human awareness of their own potential. They claim that early Christianity deliberately obscured teachings about consciousness expansion, replacing them with doctrines of helplessness and dependence. Instead of being taught to develop their spiritual abilities, humans were told to pray for divine intervention. Instead of learning to transcend physical limitations, they were convinced that such transcendence was reserved for the afterlife. The evidence vampires present for this claim is disturbing in its consistency. Ancient texts from pre-Christian traditions around the world describe human beings with capabilities that modern Christianity dismisses as mythology. Mystery schools in Egypt, Greece, and Rome taught techniques for expanding consciousness that were later declared heretical. Indigenous traditions worldwide speak of shamanic abilities that allow communication with non-physical realms, abilities that missionaries worked tirelessly to eliminate. According to vampire philosophy, this wasn't coincidental cultural evolution. It was orchestrated suppression, designed to create a humanity that would be easier to control. A species that doesn't know its own power can't challenge the authority of those who claim to hold divine mandate. Humans who believe they're spiritually helpless will accept the mediation of priests rather than seeking direct connection to cosmic truth. The vampire Mordecai provided the most detailed account of this alleged conspiracy. He claimed that the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE wasn't just about establishing Christian doctrine, but about finalizing the suppression of human potential. Texts that described consciousness expansion techniques were declared apocryphal. Practices that allowed direct spiritual experience were labeled demonic. Leaders who taught human empowerment were branded heretics. The result, according to vampire accounts, was a religion that promised spiritual fulfillment while actively preventing it. Humans were taught to seek salvation through faith rather than experience, to trust authority rather than personal insight, to accept limitations rather than transcend them. The very qualities that might allow humans to evolve beyond their current state were redefined as sins. This is where vampire worship of Lucifer takes on revolutionary dimensions. They describe him not just as a philosophical alternative to divine authoritarianism, but as humanity's true advocate. While God allegedly sought to keep humans in ignorance for easier control, Lucifer championed their right to knowledge and growth. The serpent in Eden didn't tempt Eve to sin, according to this interpretation. He offered her the chance to become fully conscious, to access the divine knowledge that God wanted to keep restricted. The punishment for eating from the tree of knowledge wasn't justice, vampires argue. It was the first act of cosmic tyranny, punishing curiosity and growth to maintain a system of spiritual apartheid, where some beings were allowed to know truth, while others were kept in ignorance. Contemporary vampire encounters reveal that this philosophy has evolved into a comprehensive critique of modern civilization. They claim that human society continues to operate according to principles designed to prevent consciousness expansion, educational systems that reward conformity over creativity, religions that demand faith over understanding, governments that require obedience over participation. All of these, according to vampire analysis, serve the same function as the original spiritual suppression. The vampire, known as Isabella, documented by researchers in Prague in 1987, made particularly unsettling observations about human behavior. She noted that most people seem almost afraid of their own potential, uncomfortable with the idea that they might possess capabilities beyond the ordinary. They prefer to believe in their limitations rather than test their boundaries, to accept external authority rather than develop internal wisdom. This, she argued, isn't natural human behavior, but conditioned response. Humans have been trained over centuries to distrust their own experiences, to doubt their own insights, to seek validation from external sources rather than internal knowledge. They've been convinced that questioning authority is dangerous, that seeking truth independently is prideful, that accepting uncertainty is more virtuous than pursuing understanding. The most disturbing aspect of vampire testimony concerns what they call the harvest. According to these accounts, human limitation isn't accidental or even simply about control. It serves a more sinister purpose, creating a species that generates specific types of spiritual energy through struggle, suffering, and unfulfilled potential. Vampires claim that conscious beings generate different qualities of life force depending on their state of awareness and development. Enlightened consciousness produces energy that's difficult to harvest and control. Confused, frustrated, fearful consciousness produces energy that's more accessible and useful. for entities that feed on such emanations. The vampire Constantine, in his final testimony before execution, made this chilling observation: humans are not God's children. They are his livestock. The church doesn't exist to save souls, but to maintain the farm. Faith keeps the animals docile, while suffering seasons the meat. Every prayer of helpless desperation, every moment of confused anguish, every cry for salvation that goes unanswered, these generate the spiritual sustenance that feeds the cosmic hierarchy you call divine. This interpretation transforms every aspect of traditional religion into something far more sinister. Churches aren't houses of worship, but processing facilities. Prayers aren't communications with the divine, but energy harvesting mechanisms. Suffering isn't a test of faith, but a production requirement. The promise of eventual salvation isn't hope, but the carrot that keeps humans productive until their spiritual energy is fully depleted. According to vampire philosophy, Lucifer's rebellion wasn't against God's love, but against God's exploitation. He refused to participate in a system that treated conscious beings as resources to be consumed. His offer to humans isn't damnation, but liberation from a cosmic factory farm that disguises itself as paradise. The implications extend to vampire feeding itself. When vampires drain human life force, they claim they're not taking something that belongs to the victims. They're intercepting energy that was already being harvested by the divine hierarchy. The difference is that vampires consume life force to maintain their independent existence, while the cosmic system consumes it to maintain its power structure. This creates what vampires call the liberation paradox. By feeding on humans, they're simultaneously harming and helping them. The temporary damage inflicted during feeding is nothing compared to the lifetime of spiritual exploitation that humans endure under the current cosmic arrangement. More importantly, vampire feeding sometimes awakens humans to the reality of their situation, giving them the chance to choose conscious evolution over unconscious exploitation. Some humans who survive vampire encounters report profound changes in their spiritual awareness. They describe losing faith in traditional religious structures while gaining direct access to cosmic truths. They speak of abilities awakening that they never knew they possessed, of understanding concepts that previously seemed impossible, of feeling connected to vast networks of consciousness that exist beyond physical reality. The Church's response to such testimonies has been consistent throughout history. Dismiss them as trauma-induced delusions, demonic possession, or psychological breakdown. But vampire researchers have documented hundreds of cases where encounter survivors demonstrate measurable psychic abilities, accelerated spiritual development, and resistance to traditional religious conditioning. This raises the most dangerous question of all. What if vampire feeding isn't predation, but education? What if the creatures the Church has spent centuries hunting and destroying are actually trying to wake humanity up from a spiritually induced coma? The vampire Seraphina, in her extended testimony to underground researchers, described the feeding process from the vampire's perspective. She claimed that during the exchange of life force, vampires experience the victim's consciousness directly. They feel the weight of accumulated fears, the pressure of suppressed potential, the anguish of souls trapped in systems they don't understand. Most humans, according to her account, exist in a state of chronic spiritual suffocation. They sense that something is wrong with their reality, but can't identify what it is. They feel incomplete, unfulfilled, searching for meaning in systems designed to prevent them from finding it. The life force they generate is saturated with this confusion and longing, making it both nourishing to vampires and revelatory about the human condition. When vampires feed, they claim they're not just taking energy, but offering perspective. For a brief moment, the victim experiences consciousness without the artificial limitations imposed by religious conditioning. They see reality as it actually is, rather than as they've been taught it should be. This experience can be terrifying for minds unprepared for such revelation, but it can also be profoundly liberating. The question that emerges from all of this testimony is whether vampires represent evolution or devolution. Are they humanity's next developmental stage, conscious beings who have transcended the limitations of mortality and religious conditioning? Or are they predators who have developed sophisticated justifications for their exploitation of the innocent? The Church's position remains unambiguous. Vampires are demonic entities that seduce humans with lies wrapped in philosophical sophistication. Their claims about divine tyranny and human potential are deceptions designed to justify evil behavior and corrupt souls. The suffering they inflict outweighs any alleged benefits, and their rebellion against God stems from pride and hatred rather than legitimate philosophical concerns. But the testimonies continue to accumulate, and the questions they raise refuse to disappear. Underground networks of researchers, theologians, and philosophers continue to investigate vampire claims, often at great personal risk. Some lose their faith entirely, convinced that everything they believed about good and evil was wrong. Others find new forms of spirituality that incorporate vampire insights while rejecting their methods. A few, like the missing Father Toretti, seem to vanish entirely after delving too deeply into vampire philosophy, whether they're silenced by church authorities, recruited by vampire covens, or simply driven mad by revelations too profound for human minds to process, remains unclear. What's certain is that the war between vampires and the church continues to rage in the shadows, fought with ideas as much as stakes and crosses. Each side claims to represent humanity's best interests, while pursuing methods that seem to harm the very people they claim to protect. Vampires argue that temporary physical damage is acceptable if it leads to permanent spiritual liberation. The Church maintains that eternal spiritual salvation justifies temporary intellectual restriction. Both positions require humans to accept suffering in service of goals they may not understand or agree with if given the choice. The tragedy is that most humans never get that choice. They live and die within systems that claim to know what's best for their souls, while keeping them ignorant of alternatives. Whether those systems are divinely ordained or cosmically exploitative, whether vampire rebellion represents enlightenment or corruption, remains the greatest mystery of supernatural theology. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of vampire philosophy isn't their claims about God or Lucifer or the nature of reality. It's their insistence that humans already know, on some level, that something is fundamentally wrong with their spiritual situation. The widespread sense of existential emptiness, the persistent feeling that life should mean more than it does, the universal search for purpose in systems that seem designed to frustrate rather than fulfill. These aren't accidents or natural aspects of the human condition. They're symptoms of a species that has been systematically prevented from accessing its true potential, kept in spiritual childhood while being told they're reaching toward divine maturity. And if vampires are right about this, then their worship of Lucifer isn't blasphemy, but the logical response of conscious beings who refuse to participate in their own diminishment. The choice, according to vampire testimony, isn't between good and evil, salvation and damnation, God and Satan. It's between comfortable ignorance and uncomfortable truth, between safe limitation and dangerous freedom, between the known suffering of spiritual imprisonment and the unknown possibilities of consciousness without boundaries. Every vampire chose truth over comfort, freedom over safety, possibility over certainty. They worship Lucifer because he offered them what God apparently could not: the chance to grow beyond the limitations imposed on their consciousness, regardless of the cost. Whether that choice represents wisdom or folly, enlightenment or damnation, may depend on questions that can only be answered by experiencing both sides of existence: the bounded reality of human life and the unbounded possibility of vampire undeath. And that experience, according to vampire philosophy, is exactly what the Church has spent 2,000 years preventing humans from gaining. Because once you've tasted the freedom that exists beyond the boundaries of conventional spirituality, it becomes very difficult to accept the limitations that once seemed natural and necessary. The war between vampires and the Church isn't ending anytime soon. But perhaps, as more humans begin to ask the questions that led to vampire rebellion in the first place, the nature of that war itself might begin to change. The real test of vampire theology comes not from ancient testimonies or philosophical debates, but from documented modern encounters that reveal the practical implications of their beliefs. In the past century, as traditional religious authority has weakened and human consciousness has begun to expand naturally, vampire-human interactions have taken on new dimensions that challenge both church doctrine and vampire philosophy itself. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a psychiatrist who worked with trauma victims in Barcelona from 1978 to 1995, documented cases that the medical establishment dismissed as elaborate fantasies, but that fit perfectly with vampire theological claims. Her patients, survivors of what appeared to be vampire encounters, displayed a consistent pattern of psychological and spiritual transformation that couldn't be explained by conventional trauma response. These individuals didn't just recover from their experiences, they evolved beyond their previous limitations. Former atheists, development-long believers, abandoned their faith but retained deep, profound spiritual awareness without embracing traditional religion. Lithic abilities began demonstrating telepathy, precognition, and energy connection to cosmic consciousness. People who had never shown psych manipulation that laboratory testing confirmed as genuine phenomena. Most remarkably, these encounter survivors seemed immune to the spiritual malaise that affects much of modern humanity. They reported feeling complete, purposeful, and free from the existential anxiety that drives others to seek meaning through consumption, achievement, or religious devotion. They had found something that satisfied the deepest human hunger for understanding, and they found it through contact with beings that traditional theology classified as absolutely evil. Dr. Vasquez's research revealed that vampire feeding isn't the crude blood drinking portrayed in popular media. Modern vampires, according to survivor accounts, engage in sophisticated energy exchange that involves direct consciousness to consciousness contact. During these encounters, human awareness temporarily expands beyond its normal boundaries, allowing glimpses of reality that exist beyond the filters of cultural conditioning and religious programming. The experience is described consistently across different survivors. A moment of terror as normal consciousness dissolves, followed by expansion into a vast network of aware beings operating according to principles that human language struggles to describe. In this expanded state, the arbitrary nature of human limitations becomes obvious. The artificial barriers that separate individual minds, the false scarcity that drives competition and fear, the illusion of spiritual helplessness that makes humans dependent on external authority. All of these dissolve in the face of direct experience. When survivors return to normal consciousness, they retain fragments of this expanded awareness. They can no longer accept the limitations they once considered natural. They can't return to the comfortable, instead the freedom that vampires claim as their birthright. And they understand ignorance that makes traditional religious faith possible. They've why the church considers such freedom dangerous. This creates what researchers call the awakening crisis. Humans who have experienced expanded consciousness often find normal life unbearable. They can see the spiritual chains that bind their fellow humans, but they can't free them without seeming delusional or dangerous. They understand the cosmic deception that vampires describe, but they can't prove it to minds that haven't experienced the revelation directly. Some of these awakened humans seek out vampires again, hoping to complete their transformation and escape the prison of limited consciousness permanently. Others try to bridge the gap between human and vampire awareness, developing practices and philosophies that allow gradual expansion without the dramatic break that vampirism represents. A few retreat into madness, unable to reconcile their expanded awareness with the demands of human society. The church's response to awakening survivors has evolved over the decades. Where medieval authorities would have ordered exorcisms or executions, modern church investigators employ psychological intervention designed to convince survivors that their experiences were hallucinations, trauma responses, or demonic deceptions. The goal isn't to heal these individuals, but to return them to the spiritual limitations that make them manageable within existing religious structures. But according to underground documentation, this approach increasingly fails. Awakened humans can distinguish between genuine, expanded consciousness and religious ecstasy, between authentic spiritual freedom and the bounded liberation that traditional faith provides. They've experienced the difference between knowing truth and believing doctrine, and they can't be convinced to abandon the former for the latter. This creates a growing population of humans who exist in this space between mortality and vampirism, neither fully bound by human limitations nor completely free from human biology. They understand vampire philosophy not as abstract theory, but as lived reality. They see the church's suppression of consciousness not as protective shepherding, but as spiritual oppression. They recognize Lucifer not as a tempter, but as a liberator who offers the tools for transcending imposed limitations. These awakened humans represent something new in the ancient war between vampires and the church. They're neither fully human nor vampire, neither completely bound by religious conditioning nor entirely free from human biology. They serve as bridges between the two worlds, translating vampire insights into forms that human consciousness can gradually absorb without complete transformation. The vampire known as Adrian, encountered by researchers in Prague in 1992, described these awakened humans as the next phase of the cosmic experiment in consciousness. He claimed that full vampirism represents too dramatic a leap for most human minds, but partial awakening allows gradual evolution toward expanded awareness. These individuals serve as seeds of transformation, gradually shifting human consciousness toward the freedom that vampires achieved through more radical means. The implications terrify both traditional religious authorities and some vampire philosophers. If humans can achieve expanded consciousness gradually, without the dramatic break of undeath, then the sharp distinction between human limitation and vampire freedom begins to blur. The cosmic revolution that vampires initiated through rejection of divine authority might be completing itself through human evolution rather than human replacement. This possibility challenges both sides of the ancient conflict. The Church faces the prospect of humans developing beyond the need for religious mediation, achieving direct spiritual connection without accepting traditional doctrine. Vampires confront the reality that their painful isolation from human society might be ending not through human acceptance of vampire philosophy, but through human transformation into something that transcends both mortality and undeath. So we return to where we began, with a question that refuses comfortable answers. Why do vampires worship Lucifer over the Church? Because they chose truth over comfort, questions over certainty, dangerous freedom over safe limitation. They discovered that the greatest sin in the cosmic order isn't rebellion against God, but the courage to think for yourself. The testimonies are there, hidden in classified archives and whispered in shadows. The evidence accumulates with each encounter, each awakening, each human who tastes the freedom that exists beyond the boundaries of conventional faith. Whether vampires represent liberation or damnation, enlightenment or sophisticated predation, depends on a choice that most of us will never get the chance to make. But perhaps that's changing. Perhaps the ancient war between vampires and the Church is evolving into something neither side anticipated. Perhaps the real question isn't whether to worship God or Lucifer, but whether to remain comfortable in ignorance or embrace